So thanks so much for joining me. Can we start a little bit with, you of course have had this amazing career in record production. How did you get into the music biz in the first place? You were a musician yourself, aren't you?
I was a baby guitar player when the folky thing was happening in Los Angeles. So I hung out at the Ash Grove because Ed Pearl and I had gone to school together. So I was sort of de facto the house band. I'd play at the Ash Grove. I would play what was needed behind what people had. If they needed a guitarist or a banjo player or a bass player, be on the case.
Yeah, that's something which used to exist a lot of places, the house band. And then you read about all these guys who get discovered because they were backing up famous people, like down at the Lighthouse with Howard Rumsey. All those guys used to back up people coming through.
Absolutely. There were house bands not only in clubs, but in studios, which had sort of was disappearing by the time I got to be a producer.
Yeah.
But for a lot of famous studios, especially in the South, you'd book the studio because you'd get the rhythm section.
Like in Muscle Shoals.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So how did you make the transition from being from playing to the sliders?
I kind of realized that I was never going to be a good enough musician to be able to play the music I wanted to play. And that if I kept on being a musician, I'd wind up playing music I wasn't interested in for people who weren't interested in hearing music anyway. That I could be more profitably involved with the music if I did something other than concentrate on being a player.
So what was your first proper job in that area then?
My first proper job was actually a friend of my father's hooked me up with a film agent who advised me to get a job working for Billboard. But he also introduced me to a friend of his who was friendly with the people at Pacific Jazz. So I had a meeting with Phil Turetsky and Dick Bach at Pacific Jazz, sat down at the one end of a table, and Dick said, "Can you write?" I said, "Yeah, I'm a college graduate, I can write." He said, "I need a set of liner notes for a piano album. Can you write them?" I said, "Let me hear the album." So it was an album called Pianist Galore. So I sat down at a typewriter, and about an hour later, he had a set of liner notes and I had a job.
Now, this was what, about 1960? When was this?
This would have been 58 or 59.
So that was glory years of Pacific Jazz, eh? Great label.
Yes, absolutely. It was a great place to learn. It was a small independent, which meant everybody had to do everything.
Yeah.
So I would make runs down to the distributor and talk to the promotion guys. And I was in charge of shipping new releases and information to the foreign licensees and keeping track of things like that. And sort of peripherally, I learned to edit from Dick Bach, which was strange because he was a bad editor. And what got into editing was that musicians would say, "Listen, would you edit this for us? Because Dick is going to butcher it."
So you would take out bits of the solo they weren't happy with, that kind of thing?
Well, more it's either shortening solos or inserting solos from different takes.
Right. What was Dick like to work with in general?
I idolized him because he was everything a boy's idol should be. These were the days when Playboy was relatively new, and Dick religiously read Playboy every month and tried to live the lifestyle, and pretty much did.
Oh, that's great. And so you were with Pacific for how long then?
I was with Pacific Jazz for about a year, and then I was going to get drafted.
Right.
And I quickly got into an Army Reserve unit. And in those days, if you were avoiding the draft, you could do 6 months active duty and be in the reserves for 5.5 years and skip meetings. So I went on active duty, and when I came out, Pacific Jazz was in money trouble and they couldn't afford to hire me.
So then you moved to Riverside, is that right?
No, then I went to work for Val Valentine, the engineer who at Verve. Norman Granz still owned Verve. It was an independent label. And I was the assistant to the head engineer and learned a lot about storing tapes and writing down information and watching how a larger than tiny independent operated, but it was still an independent, so everybody had to do everything.
Norman Granch is a legend. Was he still doing the jazz at the Philharmonic tours then, or are those wound up?
Absolutely. I mean, his main source of income was as a concert promoter, and the record label was more or less a byproduct of that.
So you must have met Oscar Peterson coming through there then, I guess.
Actually, I never met Oscar. When Ella Fitzgerald was in town, Verve Records became the Ella Fitzgerald Service Agency. I had a little white MG convertible that she referred to as my bathtub, and she thought it was cute. So I would frequently be running errands for Ella.
So you were chauffeuring Ella, were you?
Not chauffeuring her, but I was her errand boy. Norman's idea of producing was actually, he got it right. His credit on the first albums was recorded under the personal supervision of Norman Granz.
Right.
Which says what a producer does.
Yeah. Now, were you there when Creed came in?
No, I was long gone. I was there for about 6 months, and they ran into money troubles, and I was out again. The two lowest price employees were fired.
So where did you go from there?
From there, I didn't know what I was going to do, but a friend of mine who was the distributor for Pacific Jazz, a guy named Jack Lewerk, said, "When are you going to come to work for me in Europe?" And I said, "Can I wait till tonight so I can say goodbye to my mom and dad?" He said, "You can wait till the weekend." So I went to work for a company called Interdisc, which was jointly owned by Contemporary Records, Riverside Records, and California Record Distributors. And it was to deal with the fact that American jazz albums were not really getting released very much by the record labels licensees in Europe. And with a firm over there to actually be involved in manufacturing and distribution, we'd have some leverage over those labels.
And okay, so this was a big distribution push, was it then?
It was like everything else in the record business. It was a cobbled together, let's do what we have to do to make things work operation. The main office was in Lugano, Switzerland. And this was when all the trade barriers in Europe were being re-examined. There was the inner six and the outer seven, they were called. And finally, everybody said, let's have a trade union where there aren't any barriers and you can cross international lines. So we had a warehouse in, I think it was Chiasso, which is on the Swiss-Italian border. And I was sent to Milan because that was the closest office selling records to Switzerland, and see if I could work out manufacturing processes.
So Milan, and this is 1960, 61, thereabouts, is it?
This is 59, 60.
59, 60.
And then in 60, I was shipped over to England to run the operation there. By this time, Contemporary Records decided they were not in that business, so it was pretty much Riverside.
Yeah, because Contemporary didn't continue much after 1960, did they?
Oh, yes, they did. They continued up to the time that they were bought by Fantasy. Fantasy's president, Ralph Caffel, was Jack Lewerk's partner in California Record Distributors. So he really knew about all the West Coast labels because he had been distributing them since the 50s. And Ralph is one of the smartest guys in the record business. I mean, my general attitude is that record people are stupid and greedy, and Ralph was not stupid, definitely the exception to the rule.
So this period sounds like a real apprenticeship in how the nuts and bolts of making money in the record business happens. Is that right?
Oh, it was the nuts and bolts of everything. Remember, that was the time that the Beatles were just coming back from Hamburg, and the music scene in London was very fluid. he was interested in blues and folk music, I got to go know a guy named Alexis Corner. So I was involved with a lot. Alex wanted me to be the bass player in his band, which involved the third singer was Mick Jagger.
He was the godfather of the whole British blues scene, wasn't he, Alexis Corner?
Blues Incorporated was his band. He had this very deep, plummy voice, and he was a BBC announcer and a serious blues fan.
So did you take him up on the offer to play?
I was going to, but the first gig we were going to have got busted by the musicians union, who said we can't have a Yank playing in England. We have a Brit playing in New York. I could have been a Rolling Stone.
So how did you end up at Riverside?
Oh, well, Interdisc did well enough in Europe that we were bought out by Polygram, who was a licensee covering many of the labels we were representing. So Bill Grauer, who had hired me, said, you can stay in London and be our liaison with Philips, Polygram, or you can come back to New York. And I said, if I come back to New York, can I produce? And he said, if you can talk Orrin Keepnews into it. And I was warned that Orrin ate little Jewish boys for breakfast.
So what was your first meeting with Orrin Keepnews like?
Terrifying, but we realized that we were made to be pals, that I was a science fiction fan and he'd been the science fiction editor for either Doubleday or one of the big book publishers. And we bonded on that. And the only things we disagreed with was that I couldn't smoke cigars in his office. I wasn't going to get to produce any jazz albums, but I could produce the folkies and the kids stuff and things that Orrin wasn't interested in, like Charlie Bird.
But producing folk in New York in the early 60s for Riverside is a pretty good gig.
Yes. Riverside, again, was a company where everybody had to do everything.
So again, more great apprenticeship there under a real master, eh?
Yes. And learning the business from Bill Grauer and the studio side from Orrin was the best graduate school training I could get.
You were also part of the whole bossa scene, right? Because didn't Charlie Bird put some records out that you did?
Because Orrin thought Charlie was boring, so I could produce him. So the first album I produced got Meditation, which was the first record of mine that I heard played on the radio.
How did that feel?
Amazing.
What was Charlie Bird like to work with?
Orrin was right, he was boring. He was less interested in the process of recording than anybody I've worked with.
Wow.
He would just show up and play.
I'm a huge bossa nova fan, and I love the history of that era. And of course, he's the guy that kind of comes back with the tablets from Brazil, basically, you know. But yeah. I feel he makes less of it than other people did.
Yes, because he was not very good at self-promotion.
Yeah.
And he was based on Washington, D.C. rather than New York.
Not exactly a jazz hotbed.
Right. The interesting thing is there was one rehearsal. There were Riverside, which was on 235 West 46th Street. The other side of the street, there was a storeroom. There was also a rehearsal space. So there was one rehearsal for Charlie, Joe Beam, and Orrin and me, just to see if Charlie and Joe Beam could work things out together.
So did they work together or no?
It didn't come off. I don't know why it didn't come off. The rehearsal was great. I got to participate because Joe Beam said, we need a rhythm section. Take this paper bag and rub it between your fingers. Chicka, 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 chicka. So I got to be the rhythm section for the Joe Beam, Charlie Bird band.
So how long did you stay at Riverside then?
I stayed at Riverside till it went bankrupt. Bill Grauer died under strange circumstances, and the company was a couple of $1 million in the hole to the New York banking system. So I scuffled around and got a job working for Cadman, the spoken word label. but was not at all happy.
Yeah, I wouldn't think so.
Had two young daughters, one a baby and one 2.5 years old. And my wife said, why don't we move back to California? So I did. I moved back to California and wondered what I was going to do, and asked my friend Jack Lewick, the distributor, if he knew anybody. He said, you ought to talk to Madman Muntz. He needs somebody who knows music to run his licensing. So for 1.5 years, I was in the Muntz stereo pack car stereo business.
That seemed like it's a bit of a strange period, a fallow period for you.
Well, I was doing independent production, but I needed something to pay the bills with.
Yeah, of course.
Muntz, Madman Muntz was no false advertising. He really was crazy. And I went in to interview with him, and he said, can you edit 8-track tapes? And I said, I'm the best editor on the planet, which I thought was a true statement. He said, okay, you're hired. And for 1.5 years, I was actually supposed to be a tape editor, but the guy running his music division didn't know anything about music or about how to deal with record people. So I wound up, actually, that was at the time of my life that I knew more about popular music than anything else.
I guess.
I had a license from pop record companies and was constantly on the phone to producers and especially promotion men, because it was important to put out the records that were getting dollars spent in support.
So you're with Muntz, but then eventually I think Impulse comes knocking, right? Or how does that work out?
Impulse, the ABC Records operation, which was in New York, is suddenly moved to California because they've acquired Dunhill, which becomes the tail that wags the dog. Jay Lasker is the president of Dunhill. And the record operation moves to LA. And for various reasons, Bob Thiel is out. And
Part of it, he wanted to do his own label, didn't he?
I think he wanted to get paid by somebody, and they didn't want to pay him. And there was a certain amount of stress. I don't know what the story is.
No.
But there's always a certain amount of stress in the record business. So anyway, since I was talking to people, I was talking to the guy at ABC in New York who said, Thiel's out of a job. Everybody knows you want to be a jazz producer. The record operation is moving to Los Angeles. Why don't you talk to a guy named Howard Stark? So I went in to see Howard in his office in Beverly Hills. And he said, I don't need any jazz right now. I need blues. I need something for a Bluesway release in a hurry. Can you do something for me? And I said, I knew Brownie McGee and Sonny Terry were in town. I said, how about tomorrow? You want to record them tomorrow? I said, no, how about I give you a finished master tomorrow? And he said, okay. He gave me, I think, a $3,000 budget. So I did an album, and at noon the next day, I came in with a finished master and a pasted up front and liner. And he said, you're working for me now. I said, well, I got to give Muntz 2 weeks notice. He says, you can give him all the notice you want, but you're working for me now.
Yeah, because Bluesway was the other label that you had a lot to do with at that time, right?
Yes. I was producing for Impulse and Bluesway and people like John Lee Hooker and B.B. King for the parent label for ABC.
Yeah, I saw. Yeah, you did a bunch of B.B. King records. What was he like? He always seemed to me. Obviously, I never met him. But it seems like a kind of guy who was very professional.
Yes, very professional.
So at Impulse, so you're stepping into some pretty big shoes there after Creed and Thiel. So did you feel? I mean, I would have felt intimidated walking in there. How did you feel?
I figured it was a job producing jazz records, and that's what I did. And I figured I was as good a producer of jazz records as anybody else. Unlike Creed, I didn't have a sense of an Ed Michel record is going to sound like this. And the artist is going to fit into an Ed Michel record. That an Ed Michel production was going to be the way the artist sounded, because he had to go out and live with it. And in fact, it was going to sell to people who went to hear him play live, and it should kind of reflect what they were going to hear.
And you worked with some amazing people at Impulse. I mean, I think I mentioned to you over email, some of my favorite records of all time by Alice Coltrane, Pharoah Sanders. I mean, there's a whole spiritual jazz scene, and you're really at the epicenter of all that, aren't you?
When it became identified under the name of spiritual jazz a couple of years ago, I was amazed that I was included because I'm the least spiritual person going. But it's that I had a tolerance for an artist's point of view. And I mean, Surya Alice was as spiritual as it gets. Mm-hmm. She was actually a saint in two different religions, which is pretty heavy stuff to deal with.
And of course, John had just died not long before. Now, did you ever meet him?
Yes, I'd met him a couple of times.
In what circumstances?
In clubs.
And of course, when you're coming into the scene, Pharoah and Alice, of course, obviously had been working closely with John. So there must have been kind of a heavy time for them, right? Because of his death and so on, was it?
Well, yeah, but they were both functional musicians. They were having to deal with the fact that they were making their living being musicians and they couldn't spend time thinking about John.
Yeah. I hear that when Pharoah came into the studio, it was quite the scene when he would come in with his entourage.
It was like a gypsy caravan. Cooks and waiters and dancers and singers. It was kind of wonderful because and it was surprising. When I started recording, I think the first 4 dates I'd been in New York, I went back to New York and recorded Ahmed Jamal, Pharoah, Albert Ayler, and the fourth escapes me. But I wasn't ready for Pharoah or Albert, and I had to go on the fact that I trust an artist. Mm-hmm. That the artist knows more about what he wants to do than I do, and the best thing I can do is facilitate the transfer of what the artist can do live in a club to a record. And the thing that puzzled me and still puzzles me was the contradiction about the fact that jazz, by its very nature, happens and then is gone. It's a one-time magical, mystical experience. And my job was to freeze this transient music and keep it from escaping and lock it into something that was going to last for a while.
Well, if I may, you did a magnificent job in those years, and listeners today are still very grateful for the work, for how freely you let those folks express themselves on the record. It was amazing.
Well, I mean, the fact of the matter is it was a lot of fun.
Now, I did read that when it came to Pharoah playing, he'd get into such a trance when he's playing that you have a bit of difficulty keeping things down to what would fit on an LP. So you had to be a little bit subtle in how you brought things to a close.
Well, I mean, I've told this story before to interviewers, but the fact of the matter was to cut an LP side, if you go much over 21 minutes, you lose bass and high end. And so Pharoah would play for 45 minutes. So we had to work out some way of signaling him. I mean, I was in the control room, he was in the studio. I couldn't walk in and open doors and change the sound of the room. So we figured at about 17 or 18 minutes, I'll flash the lights up and down to signal you got 3 or 4 minutes to close it down, which was great, except that Pharoah played with his eyes closed.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you weren't the producer on Karma. I think that was Bob, wasn't it? But that's one where he's going to split it over 2 sides, as I recall. But
there were a lot of things that had to split over 2 sides.
Yeah, and I mean, so many great records like Jewels of Thought, Thembi, Suman Bukman Umyun. I mean, these are just magnificent pieces. Patah, the El Daoud, that's another great session. Do you recall that one?
Yes, I recall that one because it involved picking up musicians in New York and renting a car and driving out the Coltrane home in Dix Hills and working with a home studio situation.
Because Al's had that massive harp that didn't really travel. Isn't that the issue?
No, the issue was she wanted to do it at home.
Okay, there we go.
I mean, that was an amazing record because of the two saxophonists. I mean, I was in hog heaven.
Yeah, I think it's a glorious, I mean, there's a lot of greatest hits of yours. For me, that one is top shelf. That particular recording is fantastic.
That was a record that made me believe I could do okay for Impulse.
I think you convinced a few people there. What was it like curating John's posthumous releases? Did you feel, was there some pressure around that? Or were there who was involved in those decisions?
Me and Alice. And keeping track of what was in the library was difficult. There were tapes that weren't noted any place. I mean, I know there have been John Coltrane albums that were, although he was under contract to Impulse, Rudy Van Gelder had the tapes. And I mean, those basically should have been in an Impulse vault, but the Impulse vaults were in very confused shapes. In fact, the great scandal of the record business is how badly people treat their jazz and I guess their classical and pop music tape vaults.
And of course, the worst situation was that fire, which wiped out so many of those great Impulse tapes, didn't it? It seems to me.
I've never gotten a straight answer about the fire.
Nor me, but it does appear just from the gaps in the reissues, you know, that there's just some places where they haven't got an analog source, it seems to me.
You may have lost the masters, but remember, there are always copies of the LP masters that are licensed to foreign licensees.
So maybe like Spartan, the Canadian branch would have had those, for instance?
Yes, and the Japanese licensee.
Okay.
French licensee and the German and British licensees.
So what are your thoughts about the latter stages of your time at Impulse? What's happening at the label there?
Well, Jay Lasker was fired summarily, and the guy that went in to replace him was a banker. And there's a bad history of bankers running record companies.
Yeah.
And ABC was one example of that. So actually, one of the promotion guys told me that the fact that you live in a studio for 50-hour days and nobody can find you or get hold of you meant that it took about 2 weeks to get hold of you and tell you were fired.
Wow. So were you, is that how you left Impulse? Were you fired?
Yes.
And did they tell you why?
They wanted hit records. The fact of the matter is, here's the record business in a condensed metaphorical place. Jay Lasker once put his hand on my shoulder while I'm walking down the hall and said, "You're my little money machine." I said, "Thank you, Jay." "Well, why is that?" He says, "Because you go into a studio and you make records cheaply and we sell them and I make a profit on every record you make." I said, "Thank you. Can I have a raise?" He said, "No." His vice president, Howard Stark, sat down to have a serious discussion with me once and said, "Why don't you make records that sell 100,000 copies? You sell 10,000 copies and we make $10,000. I said, "If I try and make records that sell 100,000 copies, I'll have to spend $100,000 and the odds are not good that I'm going to make that back. Aren't you happy making $10,000 instead of losing $10,000? He said, "No, I'd rather sell 100,000 copies and lose $100,000 than sell 10,000 copies and make $10,000. I said, "Would you be kind enough to repeat that sentence for me? Because I'm going to be telling this story for years and I want to do it."
This is like 73, 74. What is this?
Yeah, this is the mid-70s.
Yeah. So you're no longer with Impulse, you're in LA. And so you decide to go freelance, basically, is the idea?
Well, I didn't decide. I was willy-nilly. I was a freelance producer.
And so you started to do some work with Horizon?
Yes, John Snyder entered the picture. John was a lawyer, a serious jazz fan, and who wanted to make great art records. And John is the kind of guy who you look at and you're willing to give money to.
Right.
I am not I'm the kind of guy you look at and you try and keep money away from, because you know I will waste it by making art records.
And yet, you know, you there you were turning your profit on all those great discs, right?
Yes.
So, yeah. So with Horizon, this is where this now, of course, you'd met Charlie Haden before because he was on some of those great Impulse records that we talked about.
I met Charlie Haden when he was playing with, it wasn't Ornette's band, it was what's his name, the Canadian Paul Blaze Quintet at the, but it was Ornette and Don Cherry's music at the Hillcrest Club.
At the Hillcrest, so this is like 58 or so, right?
Or late 50s. So the first time I heard the band at the Hillcrest, I was sent down by a friend of mine who was a baritone saxophonist who said, "You've got to hear my teacher play." He's a guy named Ornette Coleman. He plays a plastic alto and he plays music unlike anything you've heard. So I went down and heard the band, and as I recall, Charlie wasn't the bass player the first time I heard
No,
them.
it might have been Don Payne or
It was Don.
yeah.
But every time I heard him after that, Charlie was the bass player. Ornette was still working as an elevator operator when it was Blaze band.
And then he made those records for Contemporary, which I think made a bit of a splash in California, but maybe not yet in New York.
Nobody in the jazz pantheon paid attention to California.
Yeah.
It was, past the outer limits.
Yeah. Not until the Battle of the Five Spot.
Yes.
I think, in fact, that Charlie and Ornette met at the Hillcrest is what I've read, and that after Ornette stopped playing, Charlie goes up to him and says, "Thank you, man. That was beautiful." And Ornette said, "No one ever tells me that." So and then they went home to Ornette's house and jammed for 2 weeks. So that's how the story goes.
That sounds perfectly correct.
So had you kept in touch with Charlie here and there over the years, or?
No, we sort of lost touch. I'll tell you, we got together when over the Liberation Music Orchestra, which had been more or less cut out. And I was reading some correspondence in here between me and the record and the vice president, actually the guy who told me to make $100,000 records and lose money. And I said, this is really important record historically, and even if we don't sell any in the United States, we're going to sell a lot of them overseas, and it needs to be alive and in the studio so we can make an excuse. I'll remix it. It could use a remix anyway, and let's put it out again. And Charlie wanted to write some liner notes, which were definitely Charlie. They were a moderate liberal position.
Yeah.
But the ABC had undergone this tremendous fear because a record was released called Eve of Destruction. And after the Eve of Destruction was a minor hit, there was an ABC stockholders meeting, and somebody asked an angry question about why are we making records like this? And the record company was terrified they put out a record and then somebody else would ask a question at an ABC stockholders meeting about. So they refused to put it out with Charlie's notes.
Wow. So, and I gather, didn't Charlie he got locked up by the junta in Portugal for a while, didn't he? I think around this time.
He wasn't locked up. They were held, I think, either at the airport or the airport extension. Charlie was, like me, a closet revolutionary.
Like many of us. And I mean, which is what I find is so amazing about that particular period is once you get down below the surface, all the lateral thinking that's happening there, right? And with these folks, the spirituality, religion, and all the rest, and politics too, right? It's quite something.
Well, none of those things are separated from life.
Yeah.
When I was I think I was still working for Madman Munson, trying to be an independent producer, and wound up producing a record for the Secretary of Information of the Black Panther Party, Elaine Brown. And I was supposed to produce a spoken word album with, I'm blocking his name, the revolutionary who finally had to get out of town and he moved to Cuba. The weekend before we were supposed to get into the studio, he left the country.
And then also, it seems to me that in the latter stage of Impulse, you also did some work with Keith Jarrett, and Charlie was part of that too, wasn't he?
Yes.
That great band they had.
Yes, the American Quintet.
Yeah.
Actually, quartet plus a percussionist.
Yeah. And Keith it seems like he was all over the place at that time, doing all kinds of different things on record.
Yes, Keith knew that what he wanted to do was make music, and there was no limit to what he wanted to do, what kind of music he wanted to make.
Yeah, and he's got so much talent. He didn't have any limits, really. Doesn't have any limits. So
at one point, he pulled off some amazing piece of piano playing, just astonishing. And so after we listened back to the take, I said, Keith, how much do you practice every day? He says, I never practice. I said, you're lying to me. You can't play like that and not practice. He says, I never practice. He says, I haven't practiced 1 minute since I stopped taking lessons from teachers. I said, okay, how much time do you spend at the piano? He said, 8 or 10 hours a day, but that's not practicing.
So let's talk about this record Closeness, which I just love. And it is quite a project. So did Charlie come to you with the idea, or how did that come together?
John Snyder wanted to make a record with Charlie. And Charlie, I'm not sure the timing and the order in which these things happened, but Charlie's father died, and Charlie went into serious depression and got back into heroin and got off of heroin and was in a halfway house and a recovery community. And I loved Charlie and wanted to make a record with him, but I didn't trust the drug connection enough to do a major record. So I suggested Charlie, in a beautiful way, was made to play duets.
I mean, just an aside on Charlie, he seems like an extraordinarily beautiful human being, like just a very kind person. Is that true?
Yes. He was also the worst kind of nudge. It was like having an aunt who would pester you about something till you got around to doing it. And still being, you couldn't get mad at him. You'd want to kill him, but but not out of anger.
And I think about the work that he did with Ornette and with Don Cherry. I mean, two guys who were leaving behind changes, leaving behind sort of root notes, whatever, and having the skill and the wit to find, the kind of the root, whatever root they were using at the time, and just play off it. It just seemed his sensitivity as a musician was remarkable.
Well, he, like all great bass players, he always knew where he was and what was needed to maintain that. And Charlie was one of the few guys who could use the term creative music and mean it. He didn't want to do something he'd done before. He wanted to find a new way through, and knew that music always offered an opportunity to do something new. So it was fantastic. And one of the great tracks that never came to see the light of day was on the Don Cherry date, which actually came out on the Golden Number, which was more takes from Closeness. So Cherry flew in. I was mixing at a studio in Burbank, and Cherry was flying in, and we'd rented him a car. And A&M, the artist relations girl at A&M, called me up and said, would you go over to the Burbank airport and straighten out, there's a problem with Cherry? I said, I'm in the middle of a mix. She said, do it now. It's important. He's an artist. He's an A&M artist, and you drop everything for A&M artists. Okay. So I got in the car and drove over to the airport about 15 minutes away. And there at the car rental counter is Cherry in full costume. And the woman said, "There's a problem here." I said, "What's the problem?" "You've got an order from A&M. Their money is good. You got all the insurance you need." He said, but we don't know what Mr. Cherry's occupation is. I said, "He's a musician." He says, "Oh, musician. I thought there was magician." "Oh, that's okay."
That's beautiful.
So the next day we were in the studio and did a take with Don playing Duzonguni, the African harp guitar. And the only way I can describe it is he was playing the guitar part from James Brown's great-grandfather.
Wow.
And Charlie overdubbed a couple of basses on it, pizzicato and arco. And why that wasn't used, I don't know.
If you listen to, I mean, I've been spending some time listening to Fela Kuti these days from like the early 70s. And it's the linkages between the West African sound and obviously the funk sound, but also Cuban music too. The more you listen, the tighter those linkages are. Right? It is really quite striking.
And Brazilian music.
Yeah, big time. It's it's the outcropping of the slave trade. This is why
exactly where the slaves landed, the music and the food changed for the better.
Yeah. And had you worked with, I guess you'd worked with Paul when you worked with Keith and with Charlie. So these were all folks you'd worked with before.
I always thought of as Paul as the most underrated drummer in jazz.
His work, I love his work on the old Bill Evans records. I think it's fantastic.
Yes. He was part of two of the great trios in jazz. He was an amazing big band drummer, which is hard to imagine when you hear in a small band.
I never think of him as a big band drummer. I think of him as just as in those intimate settings.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of places where I heard him in a big band context, but it was astonishing.
So Closeness, how do you feel about that record as it turned out?
Oh, I loved it. It was one of my favorite records.
Yeah.
Everybody always asks me, "What's the best record you ever made?" And I'd say, it's like asking me, "What's my favorite child?" But in a pile of favorites, Closeness would be there.
Yeah, it would be one of my favorites of yours for sure. I love the intimacy of it. Now, were the pieces all improvised, or did Charlie do some writing beforehand?
He wrote the piece with Ornette, OC, and on paper, it looks like an ordinary tune. And when Charlie played it for me on the bass, it sounded like an ordinary tune. And when the first time Ornette ran it down, I realized that was an Ornette tune. It was the same musician reading the same music, but filtering it through a different kind of sensibility.
One of the funny things about Charlie, and maybe this is his special sauce, or was his special sauce, is that, you know, he comes out of that background, basically playing like a country hoedown family setup, you know, and so he comes out of a background of what most people consider to be, you know, very normal music. And he seems to be able to translate some of the wild stuff his contemporaries are playing in the studio and to somehow make the track accessible, even when other people are doing their best to have it not be so. Is that?
Charlie, as one of the great jazz bass players, is interesting because he's not a jazz player. He doesn't think like a jazz player. He thinks like a musician. And since he's always recorded in the context of jazz players, he's put there, but I'm trying to find a way of saying that he's a sea anchor to life. Whatever kind of music you're playing, Charlie will connect it to the planet in the best possible way. It just occurred to me that I could have had a chance to record him with Sun Ra. And what a fool I was not to realize that till now.
The other day I was looking at sort of the master list of Impulse releases, and then there's a whole bunch of a whole bunch of release numbers for Sun Ra, but only 2 or 3 of those were released. There's a whole bunch of others. Were there a whole bunch of other sessions recorded that never saw the light of day? How would happen with Sun Ra in Impulse?
I was interested in acquiring Sun Ra for the label, and I wanted to get distribution for all of the Saturn albums that had never seen the light of day to normal record buying America. So we talked, and Sun Ra and company went in to have a meeting with the Suits, and they presented him with a standard ABC artist contract. And Sonny and his manager, his partner, took the contract back to Sun Ra Central and had it retyped so that all the things that went to ABC went to Sun Ra, and all the things that went to Sun Ra went to ABC. And he took it and said, how about we sign this? And they said, no, we can't do business with this guy. He's unreasonable.
What an opportunity gone.
Well, so then I said, let's just license 30 albums. So they did. And they licensed 30, and I think 2 or 3 of them came out.
Was it Alton Abraham? Was that the guy?
Alton Abraham, yeah, Abe. The only new album that came out of that hadn't been released was Astro Black.
But what about Space is the Place? Did you do that one?
Oh, yes, I did that one, but I did that one when, after the second meeting with ABC Suits and Sun Ra and Alton, I'm sitting in the studio and the phone rings, and one of the lawyers from ABC said, the deal is blown. We're not signing Sun Ra. I said, oh, too bad. Hung up the phone. It rang again. It was Bob Krasnow, Blue Thumb, who said, your deal with ABC blew with Sun Ra. You want to produce him for me? And I said, I'll probably get fired, but sure.
They were probably in the same bar when those calls were made. In the 70s too, you also were part of Art Pepper's late career revival, eh?
Yes.
So tell me about Art. I just was, I spent some time researching him and his, his really tragic up and down kind of career in his battles, but he'd remarried, hadn't he? Kind of gotten things together in the later 70s.
Yeah, after the last time he was in prison, I mean, the first time he was in prison, he was kind of a folk hero and was treated as. The second time he said he was just an old guy. And the first time I really knew Art, I mean, I would hear him in clubs all the time and was a fan of his since he was with a Kenton band. And I heard him in concert with the Kenton band. And I heard him in playing sessions with Zoot. It's funny because Art and Zoot came up in almost parallel circumstances and really went in different directions to get to the same kind of place. I really started to focus on Art when I was working for Pacific Jazz, and I was new at the label. They were recording an album called Hoagie Sings Carmichael, and Art got a lot of the solos, and I was absolutely blown away.
So your professional relationship with him was already 20 years old by the time that you worked with him in the late 70s.
Well, Laurie said when it was suggested that I be his producer, he said I shouldn't be his producer because I wasn't. What is it that a Boy Scout is supposed to be? Reverent? I wasn't reverent enough.
Did he demand reverence?
He may have demanded it, but he didn't get it. Anyway, we got along fine. We made the first quartet record with a beautiful rhythm section, and came back to LA, and I lived in a house in Venice and had a beautiful quadraphonic sound system in my living room. I said, Art, you've heard the album in the studio. Listen to it at somebody's home system, see how you like it. So he sat down and listened to it all the way through. And he said, can I hear it again? I said, sure. I played it a second time. And the woman I lived with had an African gray parrot who from the back room said, make a deal, you asshole.
Is there a record, when you think about the folks you've worked with, is there a record that you think ought to have been big and much more appreciated than it was? Is there a record that you think it doesn't get the credit it deserves?
I think all of them. I mean, that sounds silly and self-serving, but it's true. I was making records that were treated like they were niche market items. And I always thought that with a little exposure and a little help from promotion people, they could have spread to a much wider audience. Because when I started at Impulse, there was the explosion of alternate radio, college radio, and things, 20-minute cuts were getting played regularly. Archie Shepp was getting played regularly and not on top 40 stations. But I thought it was a shame. And when I found out from a promotion guy that on some of the buy 10 and get 3 free, to sell 10 Three Dog Nights, they wanted 3 impulses in free goods. And I thought that says something. And at an ABC sales meeting in Palm Springs, one of the distributors stood up and asked me a question and said, "Why is it that Impulse records get stolen out of record stores more than any other records?" I said, "I don't know, but what difference does it make to you? What's the difference between a record that's stolen and a record that's sold? You replace it in inventory, don't you?" The guy said, "Yeah." I said, "So?"
You mentioned Archie. What were the Attica blues sessions like?
Well, first of all, Archie and I were like cats and dogs. We just rubbed each other the wrong way. You know, when I was like, "Good morning," and I was like, "What do you mean by that, motherfucker?" But we actually made some wonderful records together. And Archie's records were always a little bit chaotic. A lot of the things weren't buttoned up straight. You know, the shirts were one button off. And we worked through that. If there had been something like the Stax Old Horn section that would go out with R&B artists, Archie would have been a fantastic leader for a road band like that.
Because when he was recording with Bob, that's what he's doing, you know, as free jazz as he got. By the time he's in your hands, he's swinging back more towards a lot more R&B influence stuff. Hey, it seems to me.
He was listening to what the kids were listening to.
Yeah.
The best musicians who kept a long career going listened to what the kids were listening to and tried to inculcate some of that in what they were doing. It's the difference between selling out and remaining contemporary.
Yeah, I think Donald Byrd did a great job of that, for instance. And, you know, a lot of people are kind of rude about his 70s work, but I think he just stayed with it, you know, and he made some great music.
Well, Donald made it work and Freddie Hubbard didn't.
Oh, well, I would say Freddie, in his initial years with Creed, I think he with CTI, those first few, like Red Clay and so on, I think are great. But then I think he loses the plot a little bit.
But Red Clay and things that he's on, like Little Sunflower, which I guess is Baggs' album,
Yeah,
are still mostly informed by a jazz sensibility. I'm thinking of things where they're informed by a pop sensibility.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's because he didn't move as far, because Donald had gotten much funkier. Like I think of like Ethiopian Nights, which is a tremendous record, the one he did for Blue Note. So I mentioned earlier, are there some projects which almost came off that you wish had come off that would have been great, do you think?
The one thing I'm sorry I never suggested, because I never took it seriously enough, would have been a B.B. King Duke Ellington album.
That would have been amazing.
I had the title for it, American Music.
Did you ever record Duke?
No, I actually spoke to him once at a Grammy celebration and said, "If I have an idea, can I approach you with it?" He says, "Absolutely." But I think that would have been wonderful. Another thing I thought about too late was Sonny Rollins and 5 percussionists, but I never got the opportunity to record him, which is too bad.
I've taken a good hour of your time this morning, and I'm enormously grateful. I would love at some point to pick this conversation up again, because as most of the time what I do is look at specific records. And then when it comes time, you know, to sort of think about how that was made. if you're willing, I would love to chat with you again at some point. I have found this incredibly illuminating, and I'm really, really grateful. So thank you very much.
Welcome, anytime.
Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day. Okay, you take care.
Aloha.
Aloha.